Is there a book that's been a guide for you, Sue?
Look, in the course of, the last 26, 27 years I've been doing film, and I started at a point where film theory and reading about film and film history was absolutely central to your practice as a filmmaker. And I got to read many of the film books from the classics like How to Make a Film by James Monaco through to now for entertainment reading. I love reading the biographies of people like Sam Goldwyn and Sidney Lumet and William Goldman and so on. But to tell you the truth, it's these days I think reading about the craft and the art of narrative and storytelling is not as strongly ingrained in film students now as it should be, because of course you can't go forward and understand what you're doing as a film practitioner unless you know the history and what's come before you.
What about Film Business, a handbook for producers? Which sounds rather like an accountancy book.
The very first film that I co-wrote, directed and produced was a film called Thanks Girls and Goodbye about the Women's Land Army. And I knew nothing about making film, but I thought, I'm going to learn how to do this. And it took 5 years, and I had a copy of the Film Producer's Handbook, and it's dog-eared and all the pages are falling out now. But yes, I did use that, and it was a fantastic guide to learn all the stages involved in making a film. Now I've rewritten it and I've written all over it, and now I teach. So it's this passing down of knowledge is terribly important.
Camille, I believe that Ingmar Bergman's book Images was important to you. What's in it?
This is a book I came across when I was in New York. At that time I was studying films in States, in Salt Lake City. And this is a book that Bergman wrote after he retired and had 40 films under his sleeves, and he actually went back and looked through all his works, and then it's a combination of his own commentaries, also his diary entries, and then reflection of the technical aspects of the making of his films. And what I always find really enticing is knowing that he's such a genius and knowing he's such a master, and then to get a glimpse of the struggle, the internal struggle that he was having, even creating and pursuing his vocation. And I found that very, very comforting in a way, and also inspiring. So that's a book that I have at my bedside table. Yeah.
What about Adam? Was there a book that guided you in those early days?
Well, it's strange because for me, as an animator, of course, everyone expects me to be a much more visual person. But for me, it was Sir Les Patterson's biography, and which, of course, led to Barry Humphries. And I always give Barry Humphries and Michael Leunig full credit for my career as an animator. Of course, since then I've read all the books on how to write a perfect screenplay, and they are of course important. But for some reason, I still go back to Barry and Michael, and maybe it's because they're locals and they deal with humour and pathos, comedy and tragedy, and universal themes. But yeah, Michael Leunig's very first book, The Penguin Leunig, was one of my favourites.
Well, of course, you write your scripts like Mary and Max, the stop-motion film about an Australian girl who's got a pen friend in the US who turns out to be a strange kind of guy who doesn't have too many friends at all. But she makes this connection with him, and he's quite a tragic figure. What sort of books have you read that influence your take on relationships?
Well, I think for me, what I've discovered over the last few years, and I always say by doing interviews, it's a form of free self-therapy. And I've done over 800 interviews apparently in the last few years, and I've worked out what it is I'm actually trying to say and why I deal with these characters. And I've realised that my characters are archetypal losers, they're outsiders. I deal with difference and the other, and I think it goes back to the days when I was in the schoolyard, because I'd always tend to befriend the kids that were teased or bullied, and I had a degree of empathy that I couldn't understand why the other kids didn't have this empathy. I of course didn't know what empathy meant back then, but I root for the underdog. I love the underdog. People say I make films about disability, which I don't. I make films about being lonely, being melancholic, and
there'd be
feeling...
quite a few characters in fiction that would have appealed to you on that.
Oh, of course. Look, I've just reread The Catcher in the Rye, The Outsiders. I tend to gravitate towards a fiction that is dealing with the archetypal outsider, and I don't know, I actually reread Frankenstein, and I thought, I can relate to him as well, so...
All he wanted was love, like all of us.
And he was different. Boy, was he different,
Camille, I know Robert McKee's book Story, which I mentioned before, is the Bible for scriptwriters of a sort. And I believe you've read it. Of course, there's a whole industry around Robert McKee, and of film, he says, the cinema's master storytellers give us the double-edged encounter we crave. First, the discovery of a world we do not know. Second, once inside this alien world, we find ourselves. Why is this book so popular with filmmakers? Why do people flock to him?
Well, I think because he probably... what's the best way to describe it? It gives the precision to storytelling that's really has been lost. And frankly, a lot of what he writes in the book, it's not necessarily new, but he gives such a focused voice and reminds filmmakers that story is important, and story does not necessarily relate to just plots, but actually a sequence of human emotional development that has a strong cause and effect, and that gives inevitability, and it's unstoppable, and there's something beautiful about it. And I would like to also consider that somehow when people in the industry start to write books like this, discuss it on more a philosophical level rather than a practitioner's level, it gives you a sense that what we're doing is actually something meaningful.
Although he can be a bit formulaic, can't he? Because sometimes if you see a film, you say, oh, I can see that this person's read his book because it's 20 minutes now, and you know that by now this is going to happen, or there's going to be unresolved sexual tension at this point, or it's sort of a little bit formulaic. I'm not sure whether you agree.
I think. Oh, sorry. I actually think that the introduction chapter is the best part of the book. And the first thing he said, and I absolutely agree with this wholeheartedly, that story is about principle, not rules. So I never take into account of his so-called more of a formulated approach, because you got to overlook that. We, as storytellers, we tell stories very differently, with our personality, with our own insight, and with our own emotions. No one can tell you how.
What do you think?
Well, I think we're, genetically wired to want to read narrative, into everything, into our, the way we make sense of our daily life, the way we make sense of our family lives, our personal lives, our careers, so on. But it's codified in very, very long-standing narrative traditions, and really the same stories that we're telling now find their roots in stories that were told thousands and thousands of years ago. And you only need to look at, fairy tales and mythology and to see how relevant those stories are to present day and contemporary culture in which we live, to know that. But I think people get hung up on the idea that there are rules and, there's a framework to tell the perfect story. And, truly, if the Hollywood studios really knew that secret elixir, or if any of us knew, we'd all be making a lot more money than we probably do. But it's not so much about being tied into the formulas, but to understand where they come from and to understand the structure of things like the hero's journey, to know they're deeply ingrained, as, we're genetically wired in some ways to to understand that story, but then to riff on it. You know, it's like 12-bar blues. You know, you've got the basic structure, but, you know, the blues tradition continues to evolve and has, you know, for decades.
So as a producer, it's your task to find the best people to make a movie, and this includes the script writers. How do you find a good script writer? Because a complaint you hear is that it's difficult to find good scripts.
I actually think writing is the hardest thing in the world, just about, for anyone to do, and for screenwriters. You know, I just have the most enormous admiration, really, for any screenwriter. To somehow bring together, you know, character and plot and theme in a way that lifts, and that writer has to, from the beginning of having typed it onto paper, imagine how that could lift in the hands of a great director onto the screen. I mean, it's a Herculean task. I have had the great privilege of working with some amazing writers, people like Alison Tilson, and with Jocelyn Moorhouse more recently, and with documentary writer Daryl Delora, and it's a gift. I think it's, trying to imagine how to encapsulate in the written word what which writers can do actually in a novel very quickly. You know, in one sentence, you know, it's a dark and stormy night, you conjure up something that we spend millions to recreate. But we have to somehow, as filmmakers, lift those words off the page and into this experience that we share when the lights go down, the curtains open and the film begins. And that's not the literary experience, that's the experience of emotion and spectacle and all the things that great cinema is.
Let's talk about adaptation, because it's an obvious connection between books and films. And Sue, your current project is an adaptation of Rosalie Ham's The Dressmaker, about a seamstress who returns to an Australian town to care for her sick mother, and she ends up making outfits for the townspeople. There's a sick and dying mother in your film too, but we'll just leave that for a moment. What do you think? Why do you think this book would make a good film?
Well, it's interesting because you've just described a plot, but not the story. Because the story is the thing that we turn into the wonderful cinema experience. And that is, if you can imagine this little country town called Dungatar, and I bet there's a number of you who've read this book, The Dressmaker. Put up your hand if you've read The Dressmaker. Look, there's actually quite a few of you here. But here we have, in the 50s, a small country town in the wheat fields, the Mallee. So, you know, in the back of absolutely nowhere, and into this returns Tilly, who's been living and working in Paris, and working with the couturier dressmakers, and learnt the skills, of Dior and Balenciaga, Madame Vianney, and so on. And yet she comes back to this little town to look after her mad mother. She doesn't want to be there, the town don't particularly want her to be there, and gradually we learn what actually happens to her and why she left in the first place. But of course she's got something they want, and that is she can make these beautiful gowns. So all of a sudden the town's women, these frumpy Mallee women, start floating around Balenciaga, rip-offs and so on. I mean, incredible gowns and fabrics and so on. But the story here is one of, extraordinary visuals, and it's a sad story, but also a very funny story. And you bring a story like that, and I read the Rosalie's book when it did first come out, although I didn't get the rights until some years later. But you read that, and you just think, this would make the most wonderful, film experience, to go into that world. And the right person for this would be someone like Jocelyn Moorhouse, who has that wonderful capacity in films like Proof, for instance, to get that balance between, the comedy and the tragedy.
Adam Elliott, the constant gripe about about book to film adaptations is that the films aren't as good as the book or even better than the book. What's happening there? Why do you think it's hard to adapt books?
Well, look, I think for me, because I'm an auteur, which my father says is ridiculous. I'm an entertainer, but as a writer director, look, I think it's like getting on Mary Max. We had sculptors who would come in and sculpt all the little characters for us. Now I had to draw them first, and I thought, how am I going to teach them to draw, to create these characters the way I want them? It's like a sculptor trying to teach his apprentice how to sculpt, and it's very hard to get these indescribable, these little things that are just who you are. You can't; they're not tangible. So, to adapt a screenplay or adapt anything is there's always going to be things that get lost in translation. And that's why I could never adapt from somebody. I have to write it myself because I'm worried that it would get filtered down or, there'd be an essence that would be lost. So, for me, I could never do it, but I really admire other people who can, adapt.
You read John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath and then you watched the movie adaptation. What did you think about that?
Well, again, there were things that were lost. I mean, you're comparing two different art forms and they're never going to perfectly align. Actually, I'd love to do a claymation of the Grapes of Wrath. But I think, it's a real struggle because you're going from something that is, cinema is all the senses. I mean, people would argue that you don't smell, but I think you do smell. You can say the character smelt of licorice, and then suddenly the audience can smell that. So I think that film is far more. It pushes more buttons, whereas reading, reading is such a personal, isolated experience. When you go to the cinema, you're generally surrounded by people. Getting back to what you were saying before about script books and Robert McKee, my favourite line from Story, Robert McKee's book, is storytelling is equipment for living. And when I create a film, I pretend we're all sitting around a giant campfire like we were hundreds of years ago, and I'm the shaman and I'm telling a story. And that's the way I see storytelling.
Camille, I mean, you read screenplays too.
Oh, I love reading screenplays, yes, very much.
And one of the ones that you nominated was Ingmar Bergman's The Marriage Scenarios, which are 3 screenplays. What Scenes from a Marriage, Face to Face and Autumn Sonata. What do you get from reading the screenplay? I mean, can you see the whole thing emerging in your head, or does that depend very much on the actors and the finer points of the setting? What are you looking for when you read screenplays?
I want to echo what Adam was saying, that for me, the difference between cinema and literature is cinema is very much like music. When you listen to music, you don't pay attention to notes. But when you read, it's more of a matter of the mind, and so you do pay attention to the words, and that's the building block. And reading screenplays it's really a vehicle for me to become aware of those notes to the music. And again, words are only part of the making of the film. So on the more guilty pleasure and a private level, and I was always wondering how would I treat with the same material, even though if I have the same words. It's an exercise. It's a fun one too.
And what do you discover? What kinds of things? What kinds of colours do you use? If you see the screenplay as the outline, I suppose, of what you might be looking at.
I always want to make the same film but very differently.
How do you do that? The same film but differently?
Oh, just imagine it. Yeah. I love doing it, and I read all kinds of screenplays, and so.
Well,
the script is absolutely central. It's a great truism that you can make a very bad film from a very good script, but you can never make a very good film from a bad script. It's it's the blueprint. It's the articulation of the vision. And then the storytelling, of course, happens in every aspect of the filmmaking. The costumes tell a story. The light and design tells a story. The music tells a story. The editor, and it's a truly collaborative art, and we are all storytellers. But the trick is that, and this is where the director is so important, is having that vision that can inspire and bring all of those storytellers together to tell, the same wonderful story. And it's alchemy. You just hope that the sum will be greater than the sum of the parts. Sorry, the whole will be greater than the sum of the parts.
Are there books or that just are too inward-looking to ever make a film? I mean,
Oh, well, again, it's another truism. Great literature does not necessarily make great film. And they can be two quite different things. That's not to say that great literature can't make great films, and I personally believe I'm working with great literature right now in the Dressmaker. But the point there is, the books are an art form. The novelist's journey is a different journey to the filmmaker's journey. So it's a conversation really between the two, and sometimes that can lead to wonderful film and wonderful art, and a lot of the time it doesn't. It's just a disappointment. And I'm a sucker. When those lights go down, I'm not there watching the film craft and how it's being made. I'm just there being immersed and loving the cinematic experience. And you want something to work in its own form as cinema. And you can get let down if you've fallen in love with a book and it doesn't live up to your expectations.
Actually getting back to The Catcher in the Rye, which of course has never been turned into a film. Apparently Jerry Lewis tried to get the rights to The Catcher in the Rye, so I think there's some novels that should never be allowed to make turned into cinema. Can you imagine what Jerry Lewis would have done to that?
So I would have argued that the road shouldn't have been turned into a film. Because
you would have, but are you arguing?
I'm arguing that The Road should not have been turned into a film, because even though it's a successful film for many people, that book is not about the plot. That book is about the internal journeys, and that would have been a very, very difficult adaptation exercise.
Camille.
I want to share something that what Sue was saying, that how script is very important as a blueprint to the film and all that. A little bit about how Little Sparrows is actually being made. There was never a script in the most biblical sense, and I'm not the first person who makes a film like this. But it was made with a very acute and very, very disciplined concept and commitment to a story, and that's so literally I would have scene breakdowns, and I knew exactly what I wanted to get out of the actors. So we would rehearse extensively before the shooting actually began. And when we arrive on the set...
But rehearse from what? From a script that didn't exist?
Because it was about discussions. It was about, finding the internal journey possible... possibly taken by the character. For me, it was more about finding the truthfulness of a character, and that's what I explore with the actors. And once they find that in the core, which is Elliott Kazan calls the spine, you can put them in any kind of situation, and that's what I did. It's almost theatrical, but yet at the same time, we turn it into a very intense movie-making experience. And thus, my cinematographer, my actors, they became co-authors of the film with me. So we made a movie together.
Adam, we've been talking about script writing, and of course, though your films are very visual. I mean, all of your films are very visual, actually. But... But what do I mean by that? I mean, your characters have to move in certain ways, and their eyebrows have to go up, and it's completely compelling in a way that using human beings is not quite as compelling, just because we can't believe this is plasticine.
Well, look, I think for me it's, of course when we go to the cinema we suspend our disbelief, and with animation you have to suspend it immediately. You have to, from that very first second, say, well, I know that these characters are not real. They're either computer generated or made out of plasticine. And I get asked all the time, Adam, when are you going to make a live action film? When are you going to work with real actors? And no one ever goes up to a live action director and say, when are you going to work with plasticine? So I always am slightly offended. And the reason is very simple. Being an animation director, I get to play God. I have total creative control. I have total creative freedom. I have that wonderful tool of exaggeration. I can really create any world I want, any character I want, and I'm not restricted. So, But having said that, I try and create characters that are very believable and authentic. And even though they're blobs of plasticine, I want you to, by the end of the film, have so much empathy for the characters. If they do die, you are genuinely moved. And so that's why I do animation.
Well, Camille, Little Sparrows centres on a woman who's dying of cancer, and she has a husband, ex-husband, I suppose he is.
Husband.
Yeah. He seemed like an ex-husband to me, but he wasn't really very connected. But and the 3 daughters who are at different stages of their lives, and they come together to work out who they are and.
It is a story about self-definition.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, what did you read? Did you read anything around this area about relationships, about dying, about sisters?
No, not at all. Yeah, I actually I read a lot of poetry in the making of the film.
What sort of poetry?
I have this E. Cummings book, and then I just love it. The sensuality of the language, and what I love about poetry, because it's so succinct, and it forces you to start to think and appreciate that distillment is necessary when it comes to art, and that's what I wanted to do. So the film will come through as a very simple and yet very refreshing and very thoughtful. So I guess I was trying to discover the essence and connecting to very diverse different art forms, and so I read a lot of poetry rather than research.